Um, what I'd like to talk about is the problem of program, and indeed some of the main problems of the contemporary left. I realise that that's quite a wide topic, and in preparing it, looking at various papers and articles and booklets and so on and so forth, I was aware of really the sort of range of ideas that we could consider to be on the left, ranging from, I suppose, just forms of Labour leftism all the way through various sort of branches of Trotskyism, Euro-communism, left communism, anarchism. And so I'm going to use a broad brush, but I suppose much of what I'm going to say relates to my own experience being involved with the Labour Left Alliance, with Labour Against the Witch Hunt, my sort of day-to-day work in those groupings, but also I suppose something of my own experience, and probably that of a number of comrades who are taking part this morning. So it's going to be broad brush, but I think there are some common trends, and I think those common trends can easily be identified. Well, I think, comrades, we can all agree that the current state of the left is far from healthy. I mean, that's something of an understatement in that way. That is probably no great news for comrades for at least the last 20 to 30 years, maybe even a lot longer, as we will see from the discussion. If we talk about the left, we've got, as the saying goes, 57 varieties of groups. Just trying to do preparation for this, I ran out with the various groups that had split in the last 20 years or so from the Socialist Workers' Party. And indeed, if you were to carry out any sort of genealogy of this, it would make most aristocratic family trees seem fairly straightforward. So we do have a problem of a plethora of groups. We do seem to have a plethora of approaches, and we don't seem to have any clear strategic lines. In comparison, I would say, with maybe the 30s, when there were some clear strategic lines, or at least some clear divisions in the workers' movement, the situation today is one of sort of confusion, and indeed, I think of a certain amount of demoralization, and indeed, in some comrades' eyes, despair. I think my talk, and indeed I hope the discussion, will turn around a number of themes, and I think they're all quite interrelated, particularly about the practice of the left, what being on the left actually means, but also how we conduct our politics, and the way that left parties and groups organize themselves, the way that a revolutionary group should constitute itself, but above all, what it should actually be doing, what it should be saying. And that, of course, then links into the question of the program that we put forward, and of course, the nature of the party. But above all, I think it turns on discussions on the issue of consciousness, and indeed what we understand by the idea of revolution, and indeed the type of consciousness necessary to carry that out. Now, I'm very well aware that what I'm saying here is perhaps in some ways quite straightforward, quite basic. It's certainly very true that what I'm saying is something that goes really back to the origins of Marxism. I'd say that it goes back even further into the 18th century, when people began, probably in a modern sense, to understand the conception of revolution, of transforming society as a conscious act. Who is going to carry that out? Who's actually going to do that? But also, what's the nature of the transformation, and how do you convince, or indeed do you need to convince a population that society must be transformed? And so those sort of basic questions are sort of questions that Marx was grappling with in the 1840s, and indeed spent all of his life organizing, writing, and debating. enriching that experience by reference to events, contemporary events in the 19th century. All of that, I think, has a lot to say to us today, particularly as it's my argument that much of the historical experience of our movement has been lost. It's been lost not only through objective circumstances, economic and social change, changing patterns and ways of work and life, and so on and so forth, but also through, in some ways, a squandering of that inheritance, and indeed sticking, I think, to a set of failed and mistaken ideas which are being constantly repeated, and indeed in some ways have become the common sense of the left. Again, I think if comrades think of the sort of activities that now constitute the left, the protests, the strikes, the sort of street activism, we can see that much of that is repeating a pattern of politics that has become embedded as really the only form of left politics. It's often also combined in terms of the internal regime of political organizations with bureaucratic controls, with a restriction on debate. And I suppose above all else, the idea of a party line which is presented to the outside world as the line of the group, and that the political differences and so forth that would naturally arise in any group of people are in a sense closed off. I mean, a good example of this is it may be happening this weekend, or certainly within the next couple of weeks. The Socialist Workers' Party will be having its conference, and it will be debating key issues. But that debate, from what we can glean, will be fairly stultifying, and indeed there will be no encouragement for real political differences and debate to take place. Now, I mentioned the SWP not because I have any particular animus against them, but simply because it's a good example of how I think much of the contemporary left regards discussion and debate, and that in turn, I think, flows from these ideas of revolutionary consciousness, the role of the party, and above all, the role of the party program. So I see these things really as being really intimately linked. And again, if we go back to the history of Marxism, particularly as it develops as organized political parties and political forms, we see that those issues occur again and again. And that indeed much of what we think of as Marxism, which has emerged particularly in the post-Russian revolutionary period, has also been attempting to grapple with those questions. But I would argue in many ways our understanding has been frozen and has been affected by particular readings of that period. And there's been a tendency, I think, simply to repeat arguments from that period and simply to reduce our understandings of consciousness to a set of slogans and a set of assumptions. So that's really where I want to begin. The main the main trends that I see at the moment, I suppose, around how we might characterize our period. And again, this reflects much of the activity of the last 5 to 10 years or so, although I would suggest that much of this definitely goes back to the late 80s and early 90s. I think the fall of the Soviet Union had a profound impact not only on world politics. It's obviously changed the balance of power in the world, but above all, it threw into question many of the assumptions of really the whole of the left. Now, the bulk of the left had very few illusions in the Soviet Union, And indeed, the Trotskyist left in particular would be very strong critics of it. So in a sense, the arguments of many, such as the SWP, that the removal of the Soviet Union would, in a sense, clear the ground for real socialism, real revolutionary politics to develop, that would seem to counter the idea that the collapse of the Soviet Union would in some senses be demoralizing or disorientating to the left. But in fact, many of the arguments that particularly what I might call conventional Trotskyists had advanced were predicated on, in fact, the possibilities of political revolution in the Soviet Union. And when in fact that didn't occur, when we got a capitalist restoration, then I think that was a very disorienting set of circumstances which many Trotskyists had difficulty coming to terms with. I think we can also see something of a disorientation with the current discussions about China, where again, comrades are sort of reaching for an understanding of the nature of Chinese society and indeed of its trajectory and its impact on world politics and great power rivalry and so forth, and are either orienting very sort of clearly towards a pro-Chinese position or simply returning to older arguments and using older categories, again, many of them drawn from the debates in Trotskyism in the 30s and the 40s, state capitalism, deformed worker state and so forth, in order to sort of come to terms with the situation. And none of these have really been sort of terribly satisfactory. So my argument is that there has been an attempt by many people to try to understand and characterize our period, in particular whether, and in some of the discussions that I've been involved with in the Labour left, arguments about whether the working class is still the revolutionary class, whether various other sectors of the oppressed can now be the driving force for revolution. None of these terribly original ideas that some of us would have encountered in the late 1960s, but even some of those ideas were developing in the immediate post-war period as well, when the expected wave of revolutions were not successful and the revolutionary wave after the Second World War was defeated. So these ideas are certainly permeating our movement at the moment. And of course, if we're trying to think about the impact of this on our ideas of program, then we go back to the way that these assumptions about consciousness place consciousness at a very low level. And indeed, you know, that's accurate. Class struggle is at a very low level. Political organization is likewise at a very low level. Probably the smallest numbers of people in organized left groups exist now globally, certainly in Britain, than probably at any time since the 1890s. So we seem to have gone back, and the assumptions about consciousness and about the possibilities of revolution either alternate towards an extreme pessimism, which means that we work from the basis that very little can be achieved above very low level campaigning and agitation, through to another set of ideas, which is what I'm really going to turn on, which is the idea of sort of revolutionary leaps. And in particular, drawing from Trotsky's transitional program, the idea that we may be on the edge of new revolutionary events in which dramatic changes and rapid changes could occur. So I want to look at perhaps a common element in much of the left's attitude towards program, and that's the idea of transition and the idea of trying to understand our period. Comrades, I'm sure, will be familiar with with Trotsky's document, the death agony of capitalism, the so-called transitional program. And this, in its various forms, does, I think, permeate the practice of quite a number of comrades either within organized Trotskyist groupings or within the broader Labour left. Again, I'm sure that particularly older comrades will be aware that many people on the Labour left have sort of passed through various Trotskyist organizations, and this, in a sense, is the sort of common sense of the left. That, in particular, that the road to socialist revolution is blocked by the existence of the bureaucratic parties, by the existence of reformism, and the way that these parties act as counter-revolutionary forces. This again is drawn from Trotsky's experience, both of events in the Soviet Union, but also of the late 1930s, in which the key argument is that the masses are potentially revolutionary. They actually are revolutionary. What is holding them back is this crisis of leadership. And so in the late 30s, Trotsky defines the central political problem, says the crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of revolutionary leadership. And above all, how to turn the small numbers of revolutionaries who exist in small scattered groups. In the case of Trotsky, his followers probably numbered thousands globally, but also even much larger groupings of communist parties or social democratic parties, left parties, were still much smaller in terms of the general population. But how to turn that quality into quantity? Now, this problem is, I suppose, the central revolutionary problem, and it's the problem that we can see Marx grappling with and trying to understand the processes of social change. Marx obviously saw the proletariat as the revolutionary class. He saw them as the class that could lead to general universal human emancipation. And he talked about the objective conditions that might make that possible. And that again was his observations empirically of what was happening in Britain, drove into those conclusions. When he was writing in the 1840s, began to describe himself as a communist, he was still grappling with ideas of whether communism could, for example, be imposed by rulers, whether communism could be introduced by sort of educated elites, rather utopian ideas of imposing it on people, but also of how the working class could become a force in recognition of its own mission. And he particularly took from the left wing of Chartism, who he knew personally, was observing, both from Europe, also through Engels, and of course when he came to live in Britain, from the late 1840s, he took the example of that, I think, as the possibility of a working class party, but with a distinct program in this way. Now, what I think the left has abandoned, and I think its abandonment is partly a product of an influence of a particular understanding of consciousness, but also it's the influence of the various defeats that we've encountered in that period that I talked about from the 1990s onwards, has been an increasing reliance on what we might call the unconscious and untheorized movement of the working class. And this is the idea that the spontaneity of the masses, particularly in struggles around everyday economic and social demands, usually and particularly in those areas where comrades put a lot of focus on trade union struggle, the use of the strike, the use of the street protest, all ways of reflecting the power of the masses. Again, not a particularly new set of ideas. Debates were occurring in the Marxist movement in the Second International before the First World War on this question, particularly Luxembourg's mass strike pamphlet, but also around that same time, the growth of a certain type of theorized syndicalism, which talked about the importance of the point of production and indeed the way that working class consciousness could be transformed by those particular types of struggle. That in particular, that these struggles would not only lead to movements against capitalism, they would also lead to one of the central problems which was identified, that of the bureaucracy and that of reformist politics as well. Now, those ideas, I think, were given much greater emphasis, and this is where I would argue that the contemporary left has drawn most influence, although Luxembourgism has, I think, been quite influential from the 50s and 60s. Rosa Luxemburg is much referred to, but very rarely read and I think fully understood. But it's, I think, through ideas of transition and the idea of the death agony of capitalism that I think we get our biggest push in this way. And this again stresses that the nature of the epoch, and by that term epoch, we're talking about a whole historical period, not just a period of downturn, economic downturn, but indeed an understanding that we live in the period of the death agony of capitalism. Now, this, I think, does tend towards a very catastrophist sense of politics. And again, comrades will be very well aware, older comrades will remember that groups like the WRP in the 1970s were very prone to talk about this idea of the crisis, and of deep and fundamental crises, that within a matter of months there would be this clash between the forces of the state and the working class. And this idea of the death agony, I think, has really become quite centrally fixed with comrades. Now, we know we're not arguing, I don't think we're arguing in any sense that capitalism is not an absolute factor. We're not arguing that the possibilities and indeed the objective conditions for the socialist transformation of society don't exist. And indeed, given the current climate situation, given the rising levels of inequality and the relationship between the developed economies and then the poorer sections, of the increasing rates of exploitation and so on, that there isn't an absolute crying need for socialist transformation globally. No one is arguing against that. The question is whether this represents, in a sense, a final crisis or really a period of transition. Now, those are not just playing with words, I think. It's, again, comes back to the idea of objective conditions, but above all, the importance of the subjective factor. And this, again, is this central point that I've been perhaps banging on. The argument in the late 30s, and again, we perhaps need to recall how dramatic that period was. The rise of fascism and the coming World War, the economic privations, and so on, would naturally give, I think, that sort of tendency would naturally raise the revolutionary tasks to that level. No one, I think, would doubt that. But I think the conclusions, and above all, the later use of those conclusions, I think does have to be brought into question. Because I think if we go back to consciousness, where the argument here is that I think Trotsky's argument, but also argument of later followers, is that existing consciousness is not just a point of departure. That's obvious. We start from where we are. But this particular reading means that to all intents and purposes, it is actually unproblematic. In other words, that the current level of consciousness can be transformed very quickly and very rapidly, and that transformation will occur as a product of the situation, of the product of the crisis of capitalism. What I think happens here is, in philosophical terms, that the distinction between the subject and the object, particularly revolutionary subjectivity, is blurred. And indeed, what we think of as conscious revolutionary subjectivity then becomes, I think, a really very fuzzy concept indeed. So that simply groups of militant workers pushing for higher wages, even in a period of great inflation, even in a period as in the 1930s, when trade union struggles were very difficult, when the resistance of the capitalist class was very strong. That argument is that then leads them towards revolutionary conclusions. Now, there's a general agreement among Marxists that workers are objectively revolutionary because of the reality and the nature of capitalism. Again, no one, I think, denies that, although I have increasingly come across arguments that in that way Marxism is outdated. Again, we're all familiar with this going back into the 1890s with Bernstein, but also pretty well in the post-war boom, similar sorts of arguments. But the argument about the revolutionary period that Trotsky enunciated, and indeed I think we have heard it again, and I think we will hear it very shortly when there's an increased tempo of strikes and protests and so forth, is that there's now a speeded up development, and that in this period that the type of educational, agitational and organizational work to win the population, the mass of the population, to a conscious revolutionary position is not necessary, that we're now in an accelerated period. And this is where we get ideas, I think, of dialectical leaps and indeed of jumping through whole historical processes in a very short period of time. The transitional period talks about the fact that in order to maintain existing conditions, that workers will become increasingly revolutionary, that given the capitalist crisis, given the epoch of decaying capitalism, there can be no systematic social reform, increases in living standards, and that these objective circumstances propel the masses to overthrow capitalism. And so that the simple defense of economic gains can provide the trigger to launch the struggle against capitalism. Now, that is a set of objective circumstances according to this reading, so that objective circumstances move workers in that direction. But what we have here is how do then Trotskyists argue that revolution should work in this period? And this is where the so-called transitional method, which not only in terms of particular demands, but also I think in terms of ideas of parties, and again, I'll come on to that towards the end, also then has its impact. This is the importance of this argument, I think, and because it is so much part of the common sense of the left, even amongst those comrades who don't believe that we're living, in a sense, in the sort of final crisis, as it were, is the argument that that consciousness is low. And indeed, in some ways, they argue that because it is low, then we need a set of demands which can bridge that low trade union, almost pre-political consciousness to a higher level. And so, in a sense, we almost sort of quite self-consciously dumb down, because it's argued there will be a momentum of the struggle which will propel those demands forward. And obviously, in the transitional program, demands to maintain living standards will bring workers into conflict with capitalism. And from there, a set of revolutionary processes will unfold, it's assumed. Any critique of this, and in particular the classical Marxist position, framed in terms of the minimum program, maximum program. Remember that the minimum program was argued by Marxists would be the maximum that capitalism could afford, and that this would again be a way of mobilizing workers, of pointing the way towards the future, consciously pointing towards the future of the socialist revolution in that way. This, it's argued, limits the struggle, and it's often condemned. We've often heard it in discussions as gradualist, as passive, and above all that it belongs to a previous era of capitalism, that the current crisis period cannot afford that. Again, if we look at the history of the post-war left, we will see plenty of examples of that from the 40s onwards, Trotsky's followers, but others on the left as well, were arguing that the post-war boom was illusory, that there would be a slump, and that we would then come into that type of crisis, that same sort of crisis that we encountered in the 1930s. And so this idea of how to build a bridge and of raising consciousness was linked to, I think, the idea of the transitional demand. It does also pose, I suppose, this idea of how workers learn, and the role of the party, the role of agitation and of explanation, and above all, the question of political education. This again is not a new problem. It was discussed extensively when the first mass workers' parties began to develop in Germany and in continental Europe from the 1880s and the 1890s. And in particular, the way that conscious socialist activism, conscious socialist education would, in a sense, intervene, would link, and would draw together the objective class struggle with subjective revolutionary consciousness. And so that the party, and above all the program that encapsulates the demands of Marxism, became really quite central debating issues in that way. What I think is interesting about both in the transitional program itself, but perhaps more importantly in the way that that people have interpreted it, and I think in defense of Trotsky here, as we all know, that many sins are committed in the name of revolutionary leaders, and turning Trotsky's formulae into a rather sort of dead set of slogans is something I'm sure that a great Marxist like Trotsky would not have done. He would have learned from his experience. I'm fairly certain of that. We can't, in a sense, blame him personally for what is said in his name. But what certainly I think has occurred has been a fairly narrow set of politics, which don't, for example, reach in many occasions much above the very lowest common denominator of politics. And again, the assumptions of pretty economistic politics, the sort of ideas that the workplace, that the strike struggle, or the agitation around limited social demands is really the way towards revolution. So the type of demands that Marx was making and putting forward, for example, in the 1860s, in the address to the First International, the address of the First International, which talks about workers having a distinctly working class program, particularly a working class understanding of what Marx, using the bourgeois expression of the time, high politics, the politics of the state, the politics of the ruling class, a distinct working class foreign policy. Remember that the First International gets a tremendous fillip from working class involvement, not only in international strike struggles, but also in the American Civil War, in solidarity with events in Poland. In other words, high politics, the politics of the ruling class. It's a working class response to that, and also, above all, an idea, a sense of giving the working class an understanding of how its politics could be transformed, could enable it to become the ruling class. So this approach is, I think, very different from the idea of the transitional approach. It actually talks and argues that we need to point a very clear road towards the transformation of society. And that involves a distinctive working class position on high politics, on constitutional questions, on the law, indeed on the political constitution of society. Marx drew lessons that workers could adopt that program very distinctly from the experience of Chartism. And it was, of course, then re-emphasized again by the way that the various parties of the Second International developed, that these were not simply confined to everyday struggles, but were raising these much higher level questions. Indeed, one of the key questions that often emerges on the contemporary left in terms of the party and the party program is what should the nature of that party be, and what should the nature of that program be? Should it, for example, be a set of aspirations, a set of oppositions, or indeed a set of economic demands? And if you look at the party programs of many of the left groups, they have a number of demands around payment, around wages, conditions, whole series of demands in this way. But many of these demands are limited in and of themselves, but what they often lack, indeed, I think they generally almost entirely lack, is any pointing towards both the socialist transformation of society and indeed these wider transformative politics, particularly around constitutional and indeed foreign policy issues about who controls society and how it's to be done. The program then often not only doesn't do that, but it's often really quite limiting. It's often, in a sense, starting from this very low base and not really going much further, not really going much higher at all in that way. I said that this has in its origins the idea of the transitional demand, but it also has its origins in ideas of a transitional party. And that transitional party is, in a sense, a sort of halfway house between a revolutionary party and a reformist party. And indeed, many of us have taken part in recent discussions and debates on the Labour left about the nature of the Labour Party and about the nature of a party where this argument of some sort of halfway house that can link both those who call themselves Marxists and revolutionaries with reformists is put forward. So this party and this program is one that many comrades say, has in a sense to be a sort of minimal program, not a minimum program, but a very minimal program. It has to be one that reformists can embrace. It has to be one in which those people who are starting to move towards socialism can, be comfortable with. And anything that raises the general level, that raises the nature of capitalism, that raises these wider questions, will either scare the horses or indeed won't be understood. So that the assumption is that we can take workers so far, but we can't really take them any further. So we have this paradox often of the idea of transition, which does claim that working class consciousness can radically be transformed in a very short space of time. We have that combined with the idea that workers at the moment are at a very low level, and that we shouldn't scare them, we shouldn't put them off, we shouldn't really talk about transforming society. We should talk about fighting for the £15 an hour for NHS workers. That should be our core demand, and that raising that, we'll talk about whether capitalism can afford it, and then we move on from there. Now, that type of argument is often then reflected in practice, and that means that where groups on the left are involved in projects, that these projects are often of a fairly amorphous and indeed quite sort of fuzzy nature. I'm sure comrades can come in from the floor and talk about examples of this, and I don't think time really permits me to go into it. But what I think it does lead to is often a very lowest common denominator politics. So that even those comrades who argue that Labour and reformism are the main problem attempt then to essentially repeat it, attempt then to simply recreate either a Labour Party Mark II or some sort of sub-Labour left grouping that campaigns, but it doesn't raise these wider questions of transformation or indeed of independent working class politics. So I think that the question of party and of programme are very intimately connected, but also the question of consciousness, and above all our understanding of the nature of that consciousness. What we're arguing, I think, here is how that consciousness can be transformed. No one doubts that under capitalism, that the working class, which still exists, which hasn't been transformed out of existence, the working class, the vast majority of society, are exploited by capitalism. No one doubts that objectively they are the universal class, the class that can emancipate the whole of society. But the question then is how is that to be achieved? Now, classical Marxism argued that required conscious political activity. And the nature of that political activity focused very much on party organization. And that party aimed to be hegemonic. That party aimed to organize and educate and to teach the working class how it could become the ruling class. Because when we say that Marxism talks about the self-emancipation of the working class, when we argue that Marxism wants the working class to be the ruling class, then how we're suggesting that should be done, how that can be achieved, is through that creation of that sense of hegemonic power, but above all of political subjectivity. Now, this debate, has taken many forms, and I've outlined some of them. It has, though, I think, now reached a stage where much of this sense of the politics of the transitional program, but combined with a lowest common denominator set of politics, has now really become the common sense of many people on the left. And that means that the question of program now becomes, I think, absolutely central. So I think the Marxists should be arguing for the creation of a consciously Marxist party, a communist party that brings together those people who can accept the Marxist program, and that program is based upon the pattern of classical Marxism, which has the goal of socialist transformation, but it also has the goal of teaching and of training, of organizing, and of developing that consciousness organizationally and socially. That means, for example, the rebuilding of the organizations of our movement, but above all, it means a very conscious educational program. I don't mean that in some sort of academic or scholarly way. I don't mean that as a discussion circle. I mean that in terms of the transformation of consciousness, in the way that Marx and Engels and Lenin argued. It also means, I think, a lot of study of the history of our movement, of the development of party programs, how Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky as well, looking at the debates that they were involved with. It also means that the historical experience of our movement needs to be re-examined and needs to be distilled and indeed relearned. Comrades will again be aware of when we are in discussion with members of the left, there are often a set of assumptions, for example, about the nature of the Leninist party, the party of a new type. Many comrades refer to the experiences of the Russian Revolution, which are very important. They're, the world's first successful seizure of power by workers. But also, we need to learn the particular context for those developments and not simply make assumptions that the politics, for example, of that post-revolutionary period in Russia and indeed in Europe and the world are in a sense sort of rules that we have to slavishly follow. We have to look at what the aim of those revolutionary developments were, how consciousness was to grow and how it was to be developed, and above all, the importance of the subjective factor in politics. So, comrades, I'll conclude there in order to allow discussion. And I hope that what I've raised is some of the sort of fundamental problems that we have in our movement. There are, many issues that arise from that about the nature of the program, about its form. Should it, for example, include, particular areas? How should it be framed? I think the argument of most classical Marxists would have been a fairly short summary that would not, for example, be overtaken by time. It would have general demands and arguments, but these would be very much linked to socialist transformation. Above all, that distinction which the transitional program claims to have elided between the minimum and the maximum, and above all, the raising of demands that can really raise consciousness, not simply confine them to an economistic set of trade union demands or some very limited social demands. The sort of debates that were occurring in Russian social democracy, I think, are still worthy of study, as indeed in German social democracy, but also in the ways that Marxists began to understand that capitalism was able to stabilize itself. And then how do we adapt to that? How do we deal with a period in which, although capitalism is objectively right, and indeed there's a burning need for its transformation, how do we then deal with that problem of a subjective consciousness? It seems to me that the transitional method, and indeed much of the practice that comes with it, the lowest common denominator party, the activism, the street protests, the focus on that type of activism has in fact been very much a failure. And that's certainly been dominant politics of many people on the left from the 1970s, if not even earlier. So I think we need to return to our basic understandings of Marxism and, in a sense, build on those, but also build on our own experience, both in the Labour Party and in the contemporary movements. Not to, in a sense, lower ourselves down to the lowest common denominator, but to really see the type of programme and the type of politics that can raise the issue of socialist transformation, and in that way reclaim the heritage of classical Marxism for the contemporary movement. So thank you, comrades.